Hello and welcome to Criminal Record, the Daily Record's weekly crime show. My name is Norman Sylvester. I'm crime reporter with the Daily Record. My special guest today is Brian Anderson. Brian has been documenting members of Britain's criminal underworld for the last 25 years and is here to talk about his many encounters. Brian, welcome to Criminal Record.
Hi Norman, pleasure to be here.
Tell me a bit about how you started photographing members of crime gangs and who were your first subjects. And I believe you also had an early encounter with the legendary so-called Glasgow Godfather, Arthur Thompson Sr. Tell us about how you got into photographing gangsters and criminals.
My kind of early memories were basically working for the National Press back in the mid-90s, which then led me to work for one of the big newspapers, and it kind of started kind of late 90s, and one of the first couple of kind of cases at the time would have been the Ice Cream Wars. Would have been documenting that through kind of news stories at the time, and that led to a kind of the first real big one would have been the serialization of Paul Ferris's book, The Ferris Conspiracy. That kind of led me on the track to photograph a lot of these kind of characters. So it was really just through the press back in the kind of late 90s, and it kind of just snowballed from there.
Yeah, you were talking about the Ice Cream Wars. I think you were referring at that time the murders of 6 members of the Doyle family in a fatal fire at their home in Rockazy, Glasgow. There were 6 family members died. There was 2 people convicted, sentenced to life, Thomas T.C. Campbell and Joe Steele. So you'd be, around about that time, they were kind of campaigning to prove their innocence, saying there'd been a miscarriage of justice. I think they were eventually cleared in 2004. And they were on bail at the time, so they would have been your first subjects, T.C. Campbell and Joe Steele.
That probably would have been the first subjects. I remember photographing T.C. for I think it would have been the Glasgow Herald at the time. And then there was a kind of daily press news scrum when Joe had been released, and I remember basically the kind of the whole of the Glasgow, Scotland's media was in Gotharlock at the time. One by one, we were all kind of let into Joe's place. Joe would have been given interviews. His mother was there at the time, so that would have been, I think that would have been late 90s. I think that was really the first kind of case.
Yeah, they'd be sentenced to life. I think T.C. Campbell would be told he must serve a minimum of 20, Joe Steele 15.
Yeah.
And they'd launched various appeals and been given bail and then recalled.
Yeah.
So at that time, I think they'd been released pending their appeal, which was subsequently successful. And by this time, the late Glasgow's so-called crime godfather, Arthur Thompson, had died in 1993. But you had a kind of early encounter with him before you started doing photographs and what have you.
Well, my memories is I think I saw him a couple of times because I was the Proven Mill, which was the kind of, that would have been his headquarters, they called it.
Proven Mill, that's in Black Hill, Proven Mill area.
Black Hill, Proven Mill area. So I was, because originally we were from Black Hill, Drumpelia Street. My family was from Black Hill, they were Acre Hill Street. And I kind of grew up, so we were always knew Thompson. We knew there was a connection.
You knew by reputation.
We knew the connection with the Proven Mill. In fact, we'd been in the Proven Mill various years through functions and different things. They used to run a Celtic supporters bus every second Saturday.
I
would bonnet. I was a kind of mascot at the time, from the Celtic supporters club. So I would have seen him around about then, but the time I really did see him would have been around 1990, 1991. And my uncle was a local gardener, Uncle Andrew. He still does it to this day. And I remember us walking through Black Hill.
Kind of Proven Mill Road,
Proven Mill Road, next to the
grave. From the
next to the kind of graveyard, which is where they called it the Ponderosa.
This is Thompson's house.
Which is Thompson's place. And I remember there was a whistle, and he'd been shouted. Andy, my uncle had turned around to speak to this guy who was leaning on the fence, and it was Thompson. And what would I have been? Maybe 13 at the time or something. And I remember him saying, how come you've not been cutting my boy's grass? Talking about
Arthur Thompson Jr.,
Junior,
who live a couple of doors along.
Yeah, and he says, "Oh, Arthur, I didn't want to come because of the trouble that's been happening, you know." And then he said to him, I remember him, so he looked at me and went, "All right, son." And I just looked at him and I just thought, bloody hell, that's Thompson there, you know. And he just, I could tell right away that just his face was like I just couldn't believe.
You found him quite intimidating, did
looking right at me, you know. And I was like, and then he went back onto my uncle again. And he says, how much would it charge to cut that small bit of grass? And my uncle said he didn't know what to say because it was Thompson, you know. And he went, £20, Arthur, you know. And he went, £20? And my uncle basically didn't know where to look. He thought, shit, I was going to say I would have done it for nothing, you know. And he went, there's £25, son, go and cut it, you know. And he went away and cut his grass. And that was
and this was his son lived 2 doors along.
He was 2 doors.
Was this around about the time of Arthur Thompson's murder? Was that the?
I think it would have been a couple of days before the funeral or something. Probably would have been. So that was my main memory of meeting Thompson. I never got to photograph Thompson, or anything like that. Obviously, the press thing came kind of years later, you know. But
he died in 1993, so
died of heart attack. Yeah.
So a kind of young man, not involved in it. And you mentioned that there was something about his eyes were quite.
It was just I don't know if it was because you're brought up with the stories, but to actually see him in person staring at me, I was like, I just didn't know where to look, you know. You obviously you're going to be intimidated.
You told me once the black eyes were
dark eyes, just looking at me, just sinister. But at the same time, it was nice enough, you know.
But at that time, you'd be a young man, a teenager.
Yeah.
And Arthur Thompson was a notorious or infamous Glasgow crime godfather. And he would be very much a major figure in that kind of Black Hill community, wouldn't he?
Yeah, 100%.
He would know him by reputation.
Yeah, he was supposedly he would run the city with an iron fist. You know, that was the thing back then.
You were meeting him for the first time.
That was the first time I'd met him.
An impressionable teenager.
It's just a pity I didn't have a camera with me at that time. That would have been a very first.
Very much so. A few years later, you had an encounter with his youngest son, Billy Thompson. Billy was a kind of different character from his dad. We know Billy was, Arthur had died in 1993, his son had been murdered in 1991. Tell us a bit about your encounter with Billy Thompson, Arthur Thompson's youngest
Well,
child.
again, this was another serialisation for a crime pull-out for a newspaper. And my remit would have been spend a couple of days with Billy. Make sure there's £100. Make sure you can get him in smarten him up for a photo shoot.
That's right. He'd fallen in hard times, hadn't he? He was living in kind of homeless hostel type accommodation in Glasgow, wasn't he?
Yeah, it was me that actually took the photo. I met him for lunch. The first time I'd met him for lunch to take photographs for the newspaper. But I think it was the week earlier that the story came in via the reporter that he was living in a kind of homeless unit in the city centre, a girls' street, in a kind of model in a girls' street. They had, they were trying to get him to speak, but obviously he wasn't up for it until they run the story about, Godfather's son, lives in homeless unit, and I had photographed him it was the front page of the paper. So I remember sitting and having my, pasta. We were in a wee Italian restaurant. I had to photograph him again, and I remember saying to him, how do you feel about, being harassed by reporters and, photographers down the years, especially your stories about your dad and things like that? And he went, do you know something? As you see that photographer that took the picture of me? I said, if I saw him, I'd put a hatchet through him.
Not realising
it was me. And I thought, geez. So that was the first encounter of him saying that, which I didn't know where to look,
Quite intimidating, really, because you don't know how these people, obviously he's fallen in hard times.
Yeah.
We believe he had a drug habit, a drug problem about that time.
He died of a drug overdose,
So obviously, when we come to this later, but you're dealing with individuals that are quite, not fragile, but, unpredictable.
Yeah, totally unpredictable. But the Thompson thing ended, so the newspaper serialisation ended up, can you get some photographs of him looking smart for the kind of the article? And the first thing I remember is getting into one of the clothes shops in the St Enoch's.
And Slater's, I think it
was. It was one of these places, and he was trying on different things. We had him trying on shirts and suits, suit jackets. And I remember the guy behind the counter saying, "Is is that Arthur Thompson's boy, you know? And he was going off in one. And then eventually he just went, I'm not wearing any of these things. Yeah. I look like a monkey, you know. That was his. I remember him saying that to me.
And it's interesting that the sales
recognised him.
He recognised him, was able to put two and two together. There's maybe a reflection as much of his dad's notoriety that he would be recognised.
Is that Arthur Thompson's son? That's what he said. So then he said to me, look, I'll wear a suit in one condition. You buy me a Rangers strip and you buy us a lock knife. So we run that by the editor at the time, and he went, well, absolutely no way we buy him the lock knife, but he can have his Rangers strip, you know. And
you couldn't have bought him a knife, you know.
Aye, yeah, that was, you know, if he'd have went out and used that night, then
there'd be a lot of trouble.
There would have been chaos. But that was my kind of memories of Thompson.
Yeah. And obviously that kind of was long after Arthur's death, you know, maybe
this would have been
10, 15 years. Something.
Yeah, this would have been 99 or something, 2000 or 2001, around about that time.
Almost a decade after his death. Yeah. You referred to earlier that we know a lot of the Glasgow sort of crime figures have come from the Black Hill, Proven Mill area, and you're from that area yourself. Have you found that helpful, you know, over the years that you've come from a similar background, you know, to the people that you're photographing?
Yeah, I suppose so, because they just see as a genuine guy, you know, from the area. I've never ever taken sides, you know, when if I went to photograph these people. I think you'd be found out right away if you were carrying stories from one, you know, kind of crime family to the next.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought the fact that I've never ever judged people, as much as I don't condone crime, I've always said that. It's never really been my bag, but aye, as long as you don't, they just see as a genuine guy who's just there doing a job. And as I say, it's been as straight as that, basically. So it's been fine. It has helped me. Yeah,
that's right. We talked earlier about, you know, the unpredictability of the people you meet.
Yeah.
Probably goes with the territory. One would, if they're involved in organised crime and violence. Who of the people that you photographed have concerned you or scared you the most? You felt the most uncomfortable and worried you about how that person might kick off, to use that expression, or you know, to talk me through a few of the kind of more troublesome shoots that you've had.
I think that the one that's been documented would have been Gary Moore. Gary Moore, when I went to photograph Gary, it was various attempts to try and get him waking from an unconscious state, and eventually, you know, I'd be photographing him, and there was one particular time where, you know, the editor wanted him for the front cover of the newspaper, but the idea was, can we get him biting a bullet? That was the idea, and I thought, well, okay, so you want me to ask him to bite a bullet? So eventually he comes, and I sees him in George Square, and I just see him
George Square
in Glasgow. I see him staggering, you know, with a long coat and a fish supper and a bottle of iron brew. You know, and then when I said to him, look, we're looking for a photograph of you biting a bullet, he then pulls out a loaded Magnum in George Square, and you can clearly see the bullets in the chamber. And I have to say, Gary, you need to put that away. You know, he went, that's okay, you know, I've got my own bullets here, we'll just use these, you know. And it was like, he was wanting to shoot the pigeons. And I think he'd been known, he told me in the past he'd been shooting pigeons in George Square. Pigeons like off the roofs and stuff like that, you know.
Was he drunk?
He was drunk, he was on everything, drink, drugs. Eventually, we get him into the studio, and myself and the picture editor was there. And eventually he's pulling out knives, and we get the shot that we want, but then eventually he starts giving it the whole Jimmy Cagney bit, you know, and waving a gun in the air, and the next thing we found ourselves trying to wrestle the gun. And you're just thinking, I didn't expect that when I went to work that morning, to wrestle a gun from a known psychopath. So it was a bit
that's what it could have
unbelievable experience. Yeah.
I was going to just for our readers and listeners, Gary Moore he died in about 2010.
Yeah.
But he had a fair bit of notoriety. Yeah. He stood trial. He was a suspect in the murders of 6 members of the Doyle family, which we referred to earlier.
Yeah.
All victims of the Glasgow's crime.
That's right.
Glasgow's ice cream wars. Their home was set on fire in April 1994. Yeah. 6 members perished who were sleeping in the flat.
Yeah.
We know that Thomas Campbell and Joe Steele were convicted of the murder, but we know Gary Moore was also charged as stood trial, but he was acquitted.
Yeah.
We also know that he was charged in 1991 with the murder of a Glasgow sex worker,
Yeah.
Dan McAnally, and in 1994 he was convicted of killing or stabbing James Boyle, the son of Jimmy Boyle, the famous killer turned sculptor and
Jimmy
author.
Boyle,
And he got so this was a guy that was unpredictable. You know,
Yeah.
how would you? I mean, these guys, you can't really predict how they're going to behave.
No.
You that's
I remember photographing him. I took my brother-in-law, and he came. I was photographing him in the Clyde side again. This was at night. This was just me and him, and I thought, I'm taking my brother-in-law, you know. And again, he's pulled out his guns in the Clyde, and at one point, he's nearly went in. He's nearly actually fell into the Clyde, and so again, you know, especially with him, I thought I better take somebody with me just in case, because you're right, somebody's, especially him, being told. I think that the sheriff said he was a known psychopath.
yeah. This was in a custody case. He
Yeah,
was.
called him a
I think his
psychopath.
partner was seeking
Yeah,
custody of their child, and I think even the female sheriff
yeah,
referred to staring eyes and
yeah.
how
And
she felt.
he was really unsettling. I mean, I don't get it very often, but you know, a few of them, the hairs in the back of your neck will stand up, and he was definitely one of them.
And these are people that don't really have any barriers, do they?
No.
There's no limits to what they can do. You know.
And I'd heard all the stories about him, and I thought he is one deranged, dangerous man. You know.
And you believe that latterly, when you told some well-known Glasgow crime figures of your encounter,
Yeah.
they would have said they would have warned you to stay away from Legion. They were scared.
Yeah,
So,
well, what happened is when I done that book, Faces of the Underworld, it was a book, you know, basically it was a book about the most notorious guys in British history, and that was the idea. So to tell the story through pictures, that was it had not really been done that way. And again, it was for people studying crime. That in the end, that was the idea. People studying crime, criminology, years to come. A bit like the Old West, you know, you'd pick up a book, you know, 100 years later, you would see, oh, there's White Earp, or there's Billy the Kid. That was the kind of thinking through our minds at the
kind
time.
of social history.
Yeah, a wee bit of social history. And he, when it was found out that I was photographing him, a lot of people weren't too happy about him, particularly.
Uh-huh.
You know, his violence against women, and that was the main reason. But the problem was, because the book, it wasn't glamorising criminals; it was telling the story, the timeline of basically crime history, and it kind of moved from the, you know, the
You felt you had to include him,
yeah,
you know,
well,
warts and all.
if you're telling the story of Glasgow, you know, the crime,
You've got to
and,
have all the
and if you're
people.
telling the ice cream wars, you're having to tell the story about these people. It wasn't, you know, the book wasn't about good guys, or it was just crime history, and he had to be there because we were telling the story. You weren't making him out to be a good guy, you know. You're just telling the story, and a lot of people. And in the end, when I spoke to him, it was like, look, the book's no Friends Reunited, you know. It's a serious crime book,
And
he has to be.
time you couldn't really
He has to be
know
part of it.
Muir's
But
role in the 80s and 90s is a very serious.
but a lot of people weren't happy about it.
One other person we're going to ask about was you photographed the former or late Glasgow crime boss, as he was known then, Tam McGraw. And that was for a book about McGraw. It was almost like a kind of biography that he authorised about himself. Tell me a bit about that meeting that you had with him.
Several meetings with Tam McGraw. The first time I'd photographed him, again, it was for the newspaper, and there was a funeral. There was a big funeral. I think it was in the Lanarkshire area of a guy called Gordon Ross. So there was no way I was going to get pictures of these guys sitting in a car. So what I'd done was climb the roof right opposite the church or chapel, whatever it was, and I was literally on top of the roof, giving it the whole Lee Harvey Oswald, but you know, with the lenses, put the lenses into place, looking right over the, you know, the church.
And this is trying to get a picture of Tam McGraw, who
I didn't even know Tam McGraw was there. It was just to photograph faces, whoever was attending. That was the only way I was going.
Just to see who turned up.
Just to see who turned up. It was obviously a massive story at the time, and I remember photographing these guys coming to the end, you know, various people, and it was only a couple of days later I was asked to come into the office, and the editor said, basically said, look, I think you photographed every major criminal in the city. You know, this is unbelievable. You've got pictures of Tam McGraw, and I couldn't believe it. And he was surrounded by some people. And this was the first time he'd been photographed since the old Edinburgh court case.
So this was a previous been photographed probably 6-7 years earlier. It was a case at the High Court in Edinburgh.
That's where he was.
Where he was cleared on drugs importation charges.
Yeah.
So this is the first time we'd seen almost in public.
Yeah. And he looked. I mean, those earlier pictures, he was kind of thin and kind of weedy looking. This time, you could tell he'd obviously looked a bit healthy. He'd been working out. He was fit.
He was a bit more prosperous.
He was, and so basically that was the first time I'd photographed him. Then I met him later on when the newspaper was shooting an advert for his book, and I met him when I was sitting having a coffee, and he came up to me and he says, "Did you take the photographs of me?" And I was like, "There's no point in lying because he knows you've took them." I says, "That was me who took the photographs, Tam." And he went, and he looked at me and he went, "How much did you get for that picture?" And I says, £100. He went, £100. He says, "Brian, I would have gave you £2,000 not to take it." And he just burst out laughing, you know. So that was the second time I'd photographed him.
You were actually in his home, weren't you?
The third time was basically when I had to photograph him for his front cover. So I don't know if you remember the book Cripes, the Crime Lord, where you just get these eyes, staring, sinister eyes, another one. And I remember turning up at his door, taxi driver had dropped me at I think it was Carrick Drive. And
this is Mount Vernon.
Mount Vernon. So he comes to the door, and I'm there with the bag, you know, with the studio lights in the bag. And he went, "What's in the bag?" And I went, "Oh, it's a bazooka, Tam." He went, "A bazooka?" And he went, "That's okay then you come." So then
it was all quite relaxed.
It was quite funny. And then basically he sat there and he kept going on about how the authorities were watching him and how they
sound quite paranoid.
I was really paranoid, and how they were bugging him and how they would drive by and they would fire darts into his brickwork. And I thought, Jesus Christ, you've been watching too many films, you know. And then at one point he says, "Right, okay, well, let's get some pictures done." I remember him telling me about the famous story about the famous Harry Benson. So he said,
Harry Benson, the Beatles photographer.
So Harry Benson was famous for photographing the Beatles. He went to America and he stayed in America and he photographed. He's one of the most famous photojournalists in history. Actually, Harry Benson sent me a forward for the book, for the Faces book, which was unbelievable. But I remember McGraw saying, "Nobody's ever photographed me." He says, "You're the first." And I went, "All right." He says, I got a letter from a guy called Harry Benson. I went, "To photograph you?" He went, "Yeah." I went, "Oh, he's brilliant. Yeah, he's a brilliant photographer. He's famous, world famous." He went, he's in his 70s and he wanted to photo. He said, "It's 77, Tam." And he went, "Well, he won't see 78 if he ever messages me again." And he went into a bit of rage, you know. He says, "If he comes near my door, I'll crack him with a baseball bat." And I thought, Jesus Christ. And so they went for kind of being, you know, wisecracking to really becoming really sinister and, you know,
you were saying that he wasn't as perhaps as scary as a kind of Gary Moore. We had that kind of
he still had that, yeah. I think a lot of them most of them have got it. Most of them have got it.
And obviously quite paranoid.
Really paranoid
about who's after him, whether it be the authorities or rival criminals.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you about someone else from a different era. Most organised crime nowadays linked to the drugs trade.
Yeah.
There was a time when most criminals, their money was made from bank robberies.
Yeah.
Probably certainly 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, maybe even in the 90s. Now, you photographed Walter Norval, who was an infamous Glasgow bank robber from the 1970s. He passed away about 10 years ago, but you photographed him in about 2010. Tell me a bit about that. What about Walter Norval? Maybe not so well known in the criminal sort of history of Glasgow, but quite an influence in his day.
Yeah, well, Walter was. I'd met Walter about 4 or 5 occasions in the Milton area, and found him to be, you know, really decent guy. You know, he was very respectful, and you know, always going on about history and in the past, some of his capers in the past. But he was, I reckon, he was the city's first crime boss, organised crime boss.
This is the 1970s.
That was the XYY gang or something.
XYY
they were
gang.
called, and they were responsible for a lot of post office jobs and bank jobs, and so he was. So that would have been different from Thompson. So he would have been on the what they call on the pavement, you know, robbing things. And I think that's where the disrespect came in for. Obviously, Norval says that Thompson was a bit wary of him, you know, and he probably the reason being Thompson wasn't on kind of out there committing robberies, and that's the kind of where the disrespect comes from.
Yeah, Walter Norval, just explain to me about what he had a gang. He was a bank robber and served time in prison, but he set up a gang that later became known as XYY gang, and basically they were doing armed robberies in Glasgow and across Scotland, banks, post offices, building society, and that was in a lot of wages snatch. That was in the era where most people used banks and post offices and got their benefits, pension money from post offices. People were paid weekly in cash. So there would be big cash deliveries on a Thursday or Friday morning. They would target that. And, it was done in quite a sophisticated level, wasn't it? I mean, he took it on to a new level of sophistication at that time.
Yeah. So basically, the reason why I'd photographed him as well was because when the faces tells the story of the organised crime, but it kind of starts off in the kind of protection rackets of the 60s, moves into the kind of 70s. That's a kind of Norval area, with the kind of bank raids and that kind of thing, and post office raids, and then it kind of then moves into the drug side of things, and that's where he had a problem with the drugs. Obviously, his old school bank robbery, he was fine with that, but when it came to the drugs, he took a kind of backseat. That wasn't his thing.
That's it. He was sentenced in 1977 to 40 years in prison, served 9. Came out in the late 1980s, and by that time
it changed.
The bank robbery whole thing was dying out. People were using banks less. There was less cash. People were getting paid monthly. The security was better. They were still happening, but not at the same scale. And by that time, the kind of drugs had taken overhand. And he was kind of old school. Didn't think much of the drug dealers, did he? He thought
he referred to them as shopkeepers.
I didn't think they were proper criminals.
Yeah, he didn't actually. He didn't respect any of these guys that kind of moved in that world. He was old school crime bank robber.
That's right. For people, anybody who remembers TV series like The Sweeney, that was where the focus of the police would be catching bank robbers. They'd be at the forefront of people like Norval and these various associates.
Definitely, but they were getting big sentences. I think that was the reason why they had to. And then obviously, as the cameras came in, it was getting more sophisticated, and that kind of eradicated that. And then it was the supergrasses came in, didn't they? And that's what kind of brought them down in the end. And then everybody then moved on to drugs because you were getting less sentences. That was the thing.
More lucrative as well.
More lucrative. Yeah.
Just to fill in a wee bit of the background, Norval stood trial in 1977 at the High Court in Glasgow. There was 4 separate trials, and because the trials were being held simultaneously, the accused were identified by letters, X, Y, etc., until proceedings could end, so that the various juries would be prejudiced by reading about the gangsters. And we know that they used a supergrass first time ever. A member of the gang gave evidence against him, a key member of the gang. And we also know, I think, one of the 2 courts in it, I think it was the North Court, the High Court, was setting fire or firebombed to try and destroy evidence.
I think in the end they tried him and a bombed out court. Norval was tried and a bombed out court because, as you say, they try to burn the evidence
because they picked the wrong court and there was no evidence there anyway.
It's unbelievable.
They weren't holding the evidence there. You've had a few encounters with some of the kind of London kind of figures, people connected with the Cray twins. So I'm going to ask you about, first of all, you photographed the infamous, notorious great train robber Ronnie Biggs before he died. Tell me about that.
That was an experience. So basically, the newspaper had wanted to set a team, myself and a journalist, a famous journalist called Dave Leslie. And he came and Blake McDonald, who was a notorious Glasgow face. And the idea was to basically have them together in this kind of British feature. So we were driving on the motorway to get to North London. News had come back that it wasn't doing so good, and in actual fact, it might get called off the time we got there. And in the end, we went ahead. We went in, and I think these were the last ever photographs of Biggs posed.
The Biggs were one of the prime suspects of the Great Train Robbery of 1963, with the biggest robbery then, Glasgow to London mail train. And he went on the run to Brazil and eventually came back.
That's right.
To effectively die to get hospital treatment in Britain. And he was basically in his last days, wasn't he?
Yeah, he basically, we photographed him and he could only communicate via a Ouija board. Because obviously he'd had several strokes. And I remember one of us had said to him, just jokingly, like, "Do you think Arthur Thompson was involved in some stage?" You know, and then he spells it out on the Ouija board, and then his son started laughing. You know, and we looked at each other and he said, "I might be in my 70s and had a stroke, but I'm still not a grass." And everybody in the room had laughed.
So this was just explain about famous Glasgow to London mail train robbery in the early 60s. And you were asked at that time, Arthur Thompson would be an up and coming figure in the crime scene.
Yeah.
And it was always suspected he may have had an involvement.
Well, it's people, you know, in the kind of crime world, people from different cities normally get what's called a drink, or you would have to okay it with certain people. Like in London, if you had to commit crime, there would be kind of some kind of token to the craze, you know, some kind of payback.
You would have to think that if it was a Glasgow to London trail train, there would have to be somebody at the Glasgow end providing information or some sort.
It's only obvious that it might have been somebody like Thompson.
And even though Thompson's dead by now, and Ronnie Biggs on his last legs, literally, you know, he still wasn't prepared to.
He just said, you know, I'm in my 70s, had a stroke, but I'm still not a grass. And we thought that was funny.
And you also photographed people that were members of the sort of famous gangs of the 60s, with linked into the Craytons, Freddie Foreman and Mad Frankie Fraser. And how did you find them? And they're obviously, they were sinister, fearsome figures.
Did they
still have that edge about them?
Yeah, but Foreman, they reckon Foreman was the, you know, once I'd done this whole kind of traveling the whole of Britain, they reckon Foreman's name was he was the gangster #1, Fred Foreman. And like he was allegedly behind every major crime coming out of London in the last 60 years or whatever. He had his fingers on everything, and even his rivals would say Foreman was the man. You know,
people might talk about the Cray twins or whatever, but he really was the
Foreman was because he was allegedly a hitman for the Crays, wasn't he? And then I think he got charged with Jack the Hat, the disappearance of the body of Jack the Hat. He got charged for that, and I think
he was quite an interesting person.
Freddie was.
And did you get? I mean, you've been 70, but when you photographed him, did these guys still have an edge about them?
I think Fred. When I photographed Fred, I was quite taken back by that because I'd seen the film The Long Good Friday, and when I mentioned to Fred, look,
supposed to be based on
I believe that film's based on you. He went, yeah, that's right. And right away,
that's a character played by Bob Hoskins.
The Harold Shan character by Bob Hoskins. So I thought he was really interesting because I'd met him I first phoned him actually, and I told him I was doing a book called Faces. I want to try and get you and Roy Shaw and a couple of the old faces, and that way, if I get you guys, everybody else will fall in line. That was the way of thinking.
Well, if you got Freddie Foreman, that'll give you a bit of kudos. Yeah.
So he was like, well, okay. Well, the first thing he said to me was, well, get yourself, hire a limousine, throw some expenses about, spend the day with me. And I thought, well, it's just me, you know. And I phoned him back. I said, Fred, it's not a big production company or anything immediate. It's just myself. I've literally got a car full of petrol, and that's it. I'm ready to come. And they went, okay, Langham's Restaurant, 7:00. So that was it. I was in, but I didn't know there was two Langham restaurants in London. So I went to the one. His one's Mayfair, so I went to the other one, and I remember outside the hotel, outside the restaurant, 10 minutes had passed. I'm thinking I'm late, and he said, the guy on the door, I said, "Is Freddie Foreman?" He went, "Freddie, I know Freddie Foreman." He said, "You sure you've got the right hotel?" And I went,
"You got the wrong one."
I said, "The right restaurant." He said, "There's two Langhams." He says, "He's at the one at Mayfair." So I've jumped in the taxi, but this time I'm half an hour late. And I'm thinking, this isn't going to go down too well.
You got him anyway.
Got him anyway. He's sitting having his dinner, and he went, "You're late, mate." And he just stared at me, and I thought, shit. And that was the first time I'd met him.
Okay. Who's been your favourite subject? Who's impressed you the most, maybe on a human level rather than a criminal level?
There's probably there was a guy in Manchester called Arthur Donnelly, who allegedly was part of the Britain's biggest armed robbers. They were the Quality Street gang in Manchester, and these were the guys that were meant to be the biggest in the country. The reason why I say Arthur is because he was. I found him to be very just very helpful on a lot of things. He would help me out. You know, anytime I was in Manchester, he'd always have a lot of time for me. You know, he'd obviously been in prison. I think he was I think he was on the Strange Ways on the Roof, the riots. I think he was he was part of that. But I would say Arthur's recently died. But Arthur, yeah, I had a lot of time for Arthur.
That's the thing I was going to pick up on. Obviously, we talk about. We'll come to this later. The sinister aspect. We've got to remember these are criminals.
Yeah, 100%.
But they don't always have horns coming out their head. You know, some of them can be quite normal on the surface.
Well, even some of the biggest psychopaths, you know, if you put it the right way and tell them exactly what you're doing a book, and you've got to remember it's a book that doesn't that book faces doesn't glorify crime. It's actually quite a sad book, and there's a lot of pain in it. And there's people. I mean, I've got photographs. There's a guy called Paul Massey coming to Manchester, and I had Paul Massey crying at his mum's funeral. I mean, that's just there's nobody in there.
This is a well-known Manchester criminal.
It's from Salford. Oh. I photographed the crazed lieutenant, a guy called God, what was his name? Albert Donahue, and he was sitting in a wheelchair, broken, dejected. You know, 60 years old, reflecting about his crimes. You know, basically paranoid that somebody's still out to get him. You know, there was times where I've been at funerals where you've basically got family members, you know, burying young members of their family, you know, at the side of the graves.
Do you find with some of the subjects that you were photographing, there was a realisation about a kind of life wasted? You know?
Life wasted, so it hardly glorifies crime, you know, that book faces.
I was going to come to that because, you know, we're talking about crime and criminals and people involved in crime, and you're documenting them.
Yeah.
But you're keen to point out you're not there to glorify them.
No. At some level, if you're putting a camera on somebody, to an extent, I'd imagine people are going to think that. But as I say, the whole reason from the kind of gangland journey is really kick-started through the media itself, and it's just led and snowballed. And I've just ended up on the kind of Faces project, which I just thought would be a good way to tell the story of British crime.
This is the books and publication where you show the photographs, and you know, you don't condone any of the criminality. It's all about taking a step back. Is that how you
yeah, of course. I've never once ever condoned crime, as I say to you, in any way, shape or form. And that's a natural thing in it that people would find. So,
finally, Brian, what do you hope will be the legacy of your photograph in years to come? You know, we've talked about, you know, the danger that we can maybe glorify some of these guys. That's not your aim. No. But what would you think, you know, for future generations? You know, what would you like to think the photographs would
I think they'll be there for people studying crime. I think you know, maybe even libraries. I think I've recently got some attention for some of the libraries wanting to maybe stock some stuff. So I thought, that's probably in the end just there for crime researchers, people researching crime, you know, say students, criminologists.
Social history.
At the end of the day, that's what it is, social history. There's a reason why, you know, it's crime is part of everyday life. You know, whether we watch soap operas or Netflix, or the reason why you've got PIN numbers on your card is because it affects everybody every day. So I suppose in that aspect, you know, if it could be used as some kind of research tool, I think that would probably be a good thing, you know.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for joining us. And thanks to our audience for tuning in to Criminal Record. If you have a question for the team, you can email reporters@dailyrecord.co.uk with the subject line Criminal Record. We'll be back next week. In the meantime, you can subscribe to listen to this podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcast by searching for Criminal Record, or you can watch it each week on our YouTube channel. Thanks once again for joining us.